Stories based on true accounts. First story. Curse of the Waters, the Terror of Outer Banks. I will never forget that summer of 2015. I was 16 years old, and my mother, Emily, decided we would spend our vacation in Outer Banks, North Carolina. We loved the beach and the tranquility of the place. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway, a well-deserved rest. But what happened that morning changed our lives forever. We were at Hatteras Beach, a secluded and serene beach known for its crystal-clear waters and white sand. The sun was shining, and the sound of the waves was like music to the ears. I was playing at the water's edge, building sandcastles, when something strange floating in the ocean caught my attention. It was a body, mutilated and horribly disfigured. The water around it was tinged with red, a terrible contrast to the blue sea. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My heart raced, and I began to tremble. I called for my mother, my voice shaky and almost inaudible. Mom, come here, quick." Emily ran to me, her expression shifting from concern to pure horror when she saw what I was pointing at. "Oh my God, Jake, get out of the water now," she screamed, pulling me away from the macabre scene. She grabbed her phone and called the police, trying to stay calm while describing the situation. The authorities arrived quickly, but it felt like time had stopped. The officers cordoned off the area, and a small group of onlookers began to gather, whispering theories and stories about what might have happened. I stood by my mother, unable to take my eyes off the body, even when the officers covered it with a tarp. Meanwhile, the investigators started examining the site, trying to find some clue that could explain what had happened to that person. I felt cold, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. There was something sinister in the air, something that couldn't be explained just by the sight of the corpse. That night, back at our hotel, I couldn't sleep. The images of that mutilated body haunted me. I tossed and turned in bed. The sound of the waves, which used to be comforting, now sounded like a sinister lament. My mother tried to comfort me, but I could see in her eyes that she was scared too. What we had seen on that beach was not something you just forgot. Hatteras Beach, once a paradise, was now marked by a terrible discovery. And little did we know that this was just the beginning of something much darker and more disturbing. Still traumatized by the gruesome discovery on the beach, my mother and I tried to continue our vacation in Outer Banks, though the shadow of what we had seen lingered over us. We were at a local cafe, trying to distract ourselves with milkshakes and sandwiches, when I noticed a strange man sitting a few tables away from us. He had a severe appearance, disheveled gray hair, and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. He was dressed ordinarily, but what stood out most was the harpoon he carried, propped against the table like an ordinary umbrella. His presence was unsettling, but there was something more about him, something I couldn't quite identify. As I tried to look away, he got up and walked towards us. My heart started to race, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. My mother was distracted, fiddling with her phone, and didn't notice when the man stopped beside our table. "You found the body, didn't you?" he said in a raspy voice, looking directly at me. My mother looked up, surprised and scared. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "That doesn't matter," he replied with a grim look. "What matters is what you saw. That man. He wasn't the first. And if you don't do something, he won't be the last." His words chilled me to the bone. How did he know what we had seen? And what did he mean by, "he won't be the last"? My mother tried to dismiss him, saying we weren't interested in hearing his stories. But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer and began to reveal disturbing details about the body we found. Details that weren't in the newspapers, that even the police seemed unaware of. "That man was tortured," he whispered, his voice laden with a strange mix of anger and sadness, "and thrown into the sea as a warning. Every 6 months, someone appears like this. Always mutilated, always thrown into the waters, and always here in Outer Banks." My mother tried to interrupt him, but he ignored her, his eyes fixed on mine. They think it's a ritual, a sacrifice. But it's not. It's revenge. Someone is seeking justice for something terrible that happened a long time ago. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe he was just a crazy person, but another part felt he was telling the truth. Something about the way he spoke, the intensity of his gaze, convinced me of it. Suddenly, he stepped back, walking towards the door. "Remember," he said before leaving, "the next one will be in 6 months. And if you don't find out who is doing this, many more will die." And with that, he disappeared, leaving my mother and me in shock. The cafe, which once seemed cozy, now felt like a place full of shadows and secrets. We left quickly, my heart still pounding. As we headed back to the hotel, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. Who was that man? And how did he know so much about the murders? That night, fear took hold of me in a way I had never felt before. The encounter with the harpoon man left us with more questions than answers, and a terrifying sense that something much darker was coming. The night after meeting the harpoon man was the worst of my life. Neither my mother nor I could sleep. We lay there, listening to the sound of the waves that once were calming but now seemed to carry a sinister omen. Every creak of the hotel floor, every whisper of the wind at the windows, made me jump. The fear was palpable. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Hatteras Beach changed. People still went there, but there was an air of tension, a strange silence hanging in the air. My mother tried to make our days seem normal, but I could see the worry in her eyes. And whenever she thought I wasn't looking, she would glance around, as if expecting the harpoon man to appear again. One day, a week after our encounter, we were walking near the Pamlico River when we saw something that made us stop. There was a small group of people gathered by the riverbank, whispering and pointing. We approached and saw another body. This time, it wasn't mutilated like the one we found in the sea, but it was clearly dead, with signs of struggle on its face and hands. The authorities soon arrived and moved us away, but not before we saw something that left us even more disturbed. Next to the body, there were strange marks on the ground, as if someone had dragged a harpoon. My mother was terrified and wanted to go home immediately, but I felt a strange need to understand what was happening. Who was the harpoon man? And why did he seem to know so much about these murders? So, I decided to do something I had never done before: investigate on my own. I started looking up old news, talking to local residents, trying to piece together this macabre puzzle. I discovered that, indeed, there were reports of bodies appearing every 6 months, always mutilated in horrific ways. And there was a pattern, always near bodies of water, as if someone wanted them to be found. I spoke with an old fisherman who told me a story that chilled my blood. Many years ago, a group of local fishermen was accused of a terrible crime. They were tried and convicted, but one of the men, a young man with a promising future, swore revenge. He disappeared into the sea, and many believed he had died. But the murders began shortly after, and everyone who knew the story believed he had come back to seek vengeance on those who had betrayed him. My mother didn't want to believe it, but I knew there was some truth to the story. There was a darkness in Outer Banks, something ancient and vengeful, and the harpoon man was part of it. 6 months passed. Fear accompanied us every day, and I knew something terrible was about to happen again. I was at home in New York, trying to return to normalcy, but the weight of that sinister promise haunted me. One night, while watching TV, a news report interrupted the program. Another body had been found in Outer Banks. This time, it wasn't mutilated, but the marks on the ground left no doubt. The harpoon man was back. Fear turned into panic. My mother and I knew we could no longer ignore it. We returned to Outer Banks, determined to confront whatever it was. When we arrived, the feeling of terror was overwhelming. People stayed in their homes, doors locked, windows closed. That night, we went to the beach where it all began. And there, in the moonlight, the harpoon man appeared again. He was standing, looking out to sea, and then he turned to us. "You came back," he said, his voice a whisper laden with sadness. "You need to understand. This won't stop until the truth is revealed." He told us about the injustice he suffered, about the anger that consumed him, and then, without further explanation, he disappeared into the dark waters, as if he were part of them. The murders stopped. There were no more bodies, no more mutilations. But the fear, the memory of what we saw and heard, never left us. The darkness in Outer Banks might have been silenced, but I knew it would never truly disappear. This experience marked us forever, and to this day, every time I hear the sound of the waves, I remember the harpoon man and the vengeance he sought. The story wasn't just about the murders, but about a broken spirit seeking justice in a terrible way. And even now, years later, the fear is still there, in the depths of my mind, where shadows dance to the sound of the sea. Second story. The Curse of the Woman of Moonlight Bay. I remember clearly that summer when Sarah and I decided to venture to Moonlight Bay. We wanted a quiet place, far from the city's noise, where we could simply listen to the sound of the waves and admire the starry sky. Moonlight Bay was perfect for that. We set up our tent right on the beach, the smell of salt and the gentle breeze enveloping us in a sense of peace and freedom that we hadn't felt in a long time. In the first few days, everything was exactly as we had planned. We walked along the sand, explored the small hidden coves, and at night, we lay on the cold sand to watch the stars. There was a sense of isolation there, as if we were in a piece of the world all our own, even with other campers scattered along the beach. Some of them were noisier, having parties and drinking late into the night, but none of that seemed to matter. We were in our bubble, immune to the hustle and bustle of others. One of those nights, we returned to our tent after a long moonlit walk. The sound of the waves was hypnotic, and the wind carried a distant, almost magical melody. But as we approached our campsite, we noticed something strange. A woman, probably in her 50s, was dancing naked on the sandy street. She seemed completely out of her mind, her movements uncoordinated, and the expression on her face a mix of ecstasy and despair. Her body glowed in the moonlight, a spectacle as bizarre as it was disturbing. We exchanged a glance, both uncertain about what to do. Should we help her, or simply ignore her and move on? We chose the latter, trying not to make any noise as we headed to our tent. But that scene stayed in my mind, a dark omen that marred our until then perfect getaway. The woman and her friends, an equally disturbing group, decided to set up camp very close to us. We could hear their loud laughter, the sound of bottles breaking, and music playing at deafening volumes. What was once a haven of peace now seemed to be turning into something sinister, a feeling of discomfort growing by the minute. Sarah tried to reassure us, saying it was just a bad night, that by morning everything would be back to normal. But I couldn't get the image of that woman out of my head, her glazed eyes and the way she moved. Something inside me knew that the tranquility we had sought was about to turn into our worst nightmare. That night seemed to last an eternity. While the sound of the waves continued in the background, another sound began to stand out. It was a low melody, almost like a chant. I thought I had imagined it, but Sarah heard it too. I lifted my head and, for a brief moment, saw a slender figure moving outside the tent. My heart raced as I realized it was the same woman from before. Now, she wore a transparent skirt that billowed in the wind, her silhouette highlighted by the moonlight. She walked slowly around our tent, her bare feet practically floating over the sand. And as she walked, she sang. A soft, disturbing melody, something that seemed to come from a distorted dream. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What is she doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to respond. I only knew that this wasn't normal, it wasn't safe. Every fiber of my being screamed for us to do something, but we were paralyzed by terror. The woman stopped for a moment, right in front of our entrance. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I could see her shadow, motionless, watching us. I could almost feel her eyes fixed on us, penetrating the fabric, invading our space. The singing continued, low, melodic, and at the same time, deeply unsettling. Seconds passed like hours. Sarah and I were trapped in terrifying silence, trying not to make the slightest noise, hoping she would go away. Finally, the shadow began to move again, circling the tent before disappearing into the darkness. The night seemed to return to normal, but the damage was already done. I knew we wouldn't be able to sleep, not with that feeling of being watched. Every little sound, every rustle of the wind, seemed amplified by our growing fear. We decided that the next morning, at the first sign of light, we would move to another part of the beach, as far away as possible from that woman and her disturbing friends. Somehow, we managed to get through the rest of the night, although neither of us really slept. When the first ray of sunlight appeared on the horizon, we were already up, packing our things with desperate speed. We wanted to leave before the strange woman woke up, before anything more disturbing could happen. The next morning, at the first sign of light, we were up, packing our things with desperate speed. We wanted to leave before the strange woman woke up, before anything more disturbing could happen. Sarah was visibly shaken, her eyes still wide with fear, while I felt a growing knot in my stomach, a sense of impending danger. We decided to move to the other end of the beach, where the high cliffs and rocks provided a bit more isolation. We carried our things in silence, casting furtive glances at the strangers' camp, trying not to attract attention. When we finally reached the new spot, we quickly set up our tent, trying to convince ourselves that we were safe now, that the distance would be enough to protect us. But the feeling of unease didn't leave us. Even with the sun shining, something in the atmosphere felt wrong, as if the beach had changed, becoming darker. Sarah tried to keep our spirits up, suggesting we explore the cliffs, but I could see she was just trying to distract herself from the fear that still consumed her. As night fell, the tension increased. We set up a small campfire and sat in silence, listening to the crackling of the flames and the constant roar of the waves. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, every shadow deeper and more threatening. We were tired, emotionally exhausted, but neither of us wanted to go into the tent. It felt as if the darkness outside was waiting to swallow us. And then, suddenly, we heard it again. The same soft melody, the same disturbing chant, carried by the wind. Sarah looked at me, panic evident in her eyes. "How did she find us?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I had no answers. I only knew that the chant seemed closer, more insistent. The melody drew nearer, and with it, the figure of the woman appeared again. This time, she was even closer, her transparent skirt billowing like a specter in the night. She moved in circles around our new camp, the chant filling the air with a sense of despair and madness. We could no longer pretend we were safe. Terror overtook us, and in a desperate impulse, we began to dismantle the tent. The time didn't matter anymore, nor did the darkness. We needed to get out of there, to flee from the malevolent presence that seemed to be pursuing us. As we ran down the beach, the chant still echoed around us, like a ghost refusing to let us go. We kept looking back, expecting to see her emerge from the shadows, with her glazed eyes and disturbing smile. That night, we left Moonlight Bay behind, with a promise never to return. But the image of that woman, her unsettling melody, and the feeling of being watched in the darkness never truly left us. Even today, when the wind blows from the sea, I still hear that soft, disturbing chant, and the fear returns, as if she is still there, waiting. Third story, A Night of Terror in Malibu. It was a summer night, and we, a group of 5 friends, decided to go to a secluded beach in Malibu to enjoy the ocean breeze. Earlier at the pier, we had met 2 girls, Emily and Jessica, and invited them to join us. The weather was perfect, with the full moon illuminating the waves and the sound of the sea calming us. We set up a bonfire and started telling scary stories, laughing and having fun. It was like any other summer night, carefree and joyful. Around 2 in the morning, Tom and I decided to move away a bit, heading to a darker corner of the beach. We wanted some privacy to talk about life, future plans, and such. We were sitting on the sand with the sound of the waves in the background when suddenly, we heard a strange noise. It was like a buzzing sound, something that didn't belong there. We looked up and saw a drone hovering above us. At first, we thought it was someone playing a prank, but there was no one else on the beach. The drone stayed there, watching us, and after a few seconds that felt like an eternity, it simply disappeared into the darkness. A chill ran down our spines. That moment of fun turned into pure fear. We decided to head back to the car quickly. On the way, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Each step felt heavier, and the sound of the sea, which was once soothing, now seemed sinister. When we reached the car, something shiny caught our attention. Emily pointed to a small device attached under the bumper. It was an AirTag, one of those trackers people use to find lost items. Panic set in. Who was following us? And why? We tried to stay calm, but fear was written all over our faces. Without thinking twice, we decided to leave and headed straight to Mark's house, which was a few miles away. When we finally arrived at Mark's house, we locked all the doors and windows. We felt a slight sense of security, but the fear lingered. We tried to relax, but it was impossible. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave us. We sat in the living room, all together, trying to make sense of what was happening. Emily started crying, and Jessica tried to comfort her, but we were all scared. Who was doing this? Why? And what did they want from us? Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the back door. Everyone froze. Mark and I grabbed some heavy objects to defend ourselves and went to check. When we reached the kitchen, we saw that the door was ajar. The cold night air was coming through the crack, making our bodies tremble even more. Mark, with trembling hands, closed and locked the door again. We went back to the living room, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of vulnerability was unbearable. We decided that it was best to stay together and not separate at any moment. While trying to stay awake, Emily received a message on her phone. It was from an unknown number. The message contained only a photo, us on the beach, laughing around the bonfire, taken from an angle none of us could have seen. That was the last straw. We knew we weren't safe there. We called the police, and they did a thorough sweep of the area but found nothing. It felt like we were dealing with a ghost, something invisible and unreachable. At dawn, the police advised us to go to relatives or friends' homes in another city until everything was resolved. Desperate, we followed their advice. Each of us went in different directions, but the fear and paranoia followed us. The feeling of being watched never went away. Weeks passed, and we tried to return to our routines. But the sense of being watched was constant. I started noticing small signs that something was still wrong. Objects in my house seemed out of place, and I often felt like someone was watching me. Then, one afternoon, while coming back from work, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside the envelope were more photos, all taken that night on the beach, as if someone was trying to tell us they were still watching. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was seemed to be watching us and wanted to keep us scared. The terror gripped me once again. I gathered all my friends, and we showed the photos to the police. Once again, they couldn't identify who was responsible. It felt like we were dealing with a ghost. Months went by, and despite all efforts, we never found out who was stalking us. The photos stopped coming, but the fear persisted. Each of us moved to a different city, trying to escape that sense of insecurity. But the truth is, we never truly felt safe again. Fourth story: The Shadow of Clearwater. The encounter with the deformed creature. That night, everything seemed perfect. Alex, Max, Emily, Olivia, and the rest of our group of friends were finally celebrating our last year of high school. The deserted beach in Clearwater had always been our refuge, and with the full moon shining over the ocean, It seemed like the ideal setting for a memorable farewell. We built a fire big enough to keep us warm, but not so bright as to attract the attention of any night watchman. Laughter, stories, and the soft music from the car radio filled the air. Emily and Olivia were dancing near the water, while Max and I talked about what life would be like after graduation. The night was perfect until something strange began to happen. Suddenly, Emily stopped dancing and stood still, staring intently at the sea. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I followed her gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. There was a dark figure, partially submerged in the water, seemingly watching us. I tried to calm myself and Emily, saying it could just be a log or something, but the truth was my heart was racing. We tried to return to normal, to ignore what we had seen and continue the night. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. It seemed like the night was getting colder, and the sound of the waves breaking on the shore took on a sinister tone. The darkness around the fire felt more oppressive, as if we were being swallowed by it. Max stepped away from the group to send a message, and that's when everything started to fall apart. Within minutes, he came running back, pale as a ghost, with his phone shaking in his hand. "Guys, we need to get out of here now," he shouted, his voice laden with panic. Before we could ask what had happened, he showed us the frantic messages on his phone. "Something is following me. I don't know what it is, but it's big and deformed. It's getting closer. We need to leave now." One of the messages read, "Max panic was contagious." We all ran to the car, trying to stay calm but with nerves on edge. Olivia started crying, and Emily was trembling so much she could barely open the car door. Sitting in the car, locked in with the engine running, Max finally managed to explain what he saw. It was a creature. I can't explain it. It looked human but deformed, with long, twisted limbs. And it was following me, man. I've never seen anything like it in my life. As Max spoke, I couldn't help but look back at the ocean, expecting to see that dark figure emerge from the water and follow us to the car. The sense of dread was almost tangible. That night, what seemed to be a perfect farewell turned into our worst nightmare. And little did we know that the mysterious figure wouldn't be forgotten so easily. And as we drove away, the sound of the waves and the wind seemed to murmur dark secrets, promises that the creature was still nearby, watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. With the car's engine roaring, we sped away from the beach, each of us consumed by terror. Max was still trembling, and I could see the fear in his eyes through the rearview mirror. Emily was holding Olivia's hand, trying to calm her, but it was useless. The fear had taken hold of all of us. As we drove along the narrow, winding road leading out of Clearwater, the feeling of being followed didn't disappear. The darkness around us seemed thicker, as if something was hiding in the shadows, watching us. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, but I couldn't shake the image of the creature Max had described. Suddenly, something moved in my peripheral vision. "Did you see that?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice betrayed the growing fear. Max looked out the window and then muttered, "Yes, it's following us." Panic filled the car again. We accelerated, the engine roaring as we tried to leave that sense of terror behind. The road seemed endless, each curve hiding new threats. The silence inside the car was broken only by our ragged breathing and the sound of the tires on the asphalt. Finally, we saw the lights of the city in the distance. It looked like an oasis of safety amid the nightmare we were living. But then, a scream cut through the air. It was Olivia. There, in the side mirror. "It's there." I glanced quickly, and my heart nearly stopped. There was the creature, its grotesque form briefly illuminated by the car's taillights. Its empty eyes seemed to pierce the soul, and its twisted mouth formed a cruel smile. I accelerated even more, determined to get us away from that thing. We reached the city in a state of complete desperation. We stopped at the first gas station we saw, quickly getting out of the car, looking around, expecting the creature to still be chasing us. But it wasn't there. At least, we couldn't see it. We tried to pull ourselves together, but we were all deeply shaken. Max couldn't stop trembling, and Emily and Olivia were quietly crying. We went into the gas station convenience store, trying to find some solace in the presence of other people. The attendant looked at us with curiosity but didn't ask any questions. We were clearly disturbed. In the days that followed, we tried to continue with our lives, but nothing was the same. Each of us carried the mark of that night on the beach. Sleep was hard to come by, and when we finally did sleep, we were tormented by nightmares of the creature. We began to drift apart, the trauma creating invisible barriers between us. Clearwater Beach, which had once been our refuge, became a haunted place in our memories. And that dark figure in the ocean was never forgotten. No matter how hard we tried to explain what happened, no one believed us. And maybe it was better that way, because deep down, each of us knew that the creature was still out there, waiting, and one day it might come back. Bonus story. I was driving down the lonely Arizona road, and it was past midnight. My name is Sam, and as a truck driver, I'm used to these solitary journeys. But that night, something felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, and the road was deserted. I was exhausted, my eyes heavy with sleep, and I desperately needed an energy drink to keep going. That's when I spotted an abandoned gas station by the roadside. The old, worn-out structure had a grim appearance, but I had no choice. I needed to stop. I parked the truck and got out, feeling the cold night air. The lights were off, and the silence was unsettling. I pushed the rusty door of the store and continued in the next video.